If you're going to be able to help former Mormons transition out of Mormonism into a relationship with Christ and into a healthy relationship with the local church, it starts with understanding that Mormonism is not just a belief system. And to be a Mormon is much, much more than just being a member of a particular church. In fact, it's an all-encompassing identity. And so our goal in mentoring former Mormons is not just to convince them of different beliefs or to get them to leave one church and join another one or help them find a place in Christian community. Those are all very important. But our ultimate goal is to help a former Mormon navigate a cultural journey to find a new identity in Christ. And so to start with, it's important to understand that Mormonism is a cultural identity. Mormonism is a complete way of life. To be a Mormon entails a deep experience of all of the shared customs and values and lifestyle that make up Latter-day Saint culture. Now, it's common in most churches to think of Mormonism as a cult. And while there is some truth to that, depending on how you define the word cult, it's really much more helpful in ministering to these people to think of Mormonism as a culture. See, that's why leaving Mormonism to attend a traditional Christian church is nothing at all like moving from one Protestant church to another Protestant church. There's a much wider gulf involved in that journey. Because of the strength of the LDS cultural identity, along with unique LDS beliefs and unique LDS practices, that transition is a significant and challenging journey for most transitioning Mormons. Now, we've been talking about culture, so we better define that. Let's talk for a moment about what is culture. Now, one definition of culture is the particular ways of thinking, speaking, and living that are shared by people with a common past and a common identity. And so every person, regardless, all of us are embedded in a culture, our own culture. And it's the culture that gives each of us a sense of identity, a sense of what our place is in the universe. And culture simplifies life in a complicated world. Our culture tells us what to do without us having to think in detail about every simple decision. And so we don't learn culture consciously. We don't sit down and study it. We just absorb it by simply being around other members of the group. That's how we learn how to think, how to speak, how to live in these particular ways. Now, based on common beliefs and common worldview, the Mormon culture takes shape like any other culture in various patterns of language, in folklore, in organizational structures, in buildings and artifacts, in forms of art, in ritual, in other shared experiences. One way that culture takes shape is in the expectations of how people will act. All of this affects Mormon people and affects how they live. In fact, for Mormons, immersion in the culture is often equated with faithfulness to the church. That's how closely related the church and its culture really are. Now, having said that, I want you to understand that there are variations within Mormon culture. Now, even though Latter-day Saints are really a tight-knit group sharing this common culture and this common identity, there's also a certain amount of variation within LDS culture. So Latter-day Saints will speak of themselves as either being active or inactive. Some are true believers, others are closet doubters. Members born into the church can often be very different from those who are converted into Mormonism. Mormons living in the heartland of Utah are often very different from Mormons living in other places around the country or around the world. And often younger generations see things very differently from older generations. But regardless of that variation, every Mormon is shaped by their culture in some way. Whether it's a greater extent or it's a lesser extent, then every Mormon is going to find their identity rooted in that overarching LDS culture. That's why this has to be the starting point for helping someone on their journey out, to understand Mormonism as a culture. Now, if you know anything about changing culture, then you've probably heard of culture shock. Let's talk about the effect of culture shock. Whenever a person leaves a familiar culture to live in a new setting, they're going to experience what's called culture shock. Now, this is a sense of confusion, of uncertainty. It often comes with a great deal of anxiety that will often affect, it will almost always affect people who are exposed to a foreign culture, a foreign environment, not just people changing religious culture, but if you go to live overseas somewhere or even move to a different part of the country, you're likely to experience culture shock because things are different than what you're used to. Now, think about this for a second, that every church that an ex-Mormon person walks into, every church has a culture of its own. Every church has ways of doing things that are simply assumed, that aren't taught, but they're just caught from the people around you. So they have ways of doing culture. And so former Mormons walking into a new church often face feelings of disorientation and discomfort when they experience these unfamiliar ways of doing things that other churches have. They may feel like they don't fit. They will experience culture shock. And so with that in mind, let's think about adapting to a new church when that means adapting to a different culture. Now, we believe that the local church is God's way of helping us grow in Christ. We believe that's the biblical pattern. And so, as such, it's important for former Mormons to develop a healthy relationship with the local church. But that's often really hard to do because much about the way that churches operate is going to seem foreign and confusing and unsettling. Ex-Mormons are going to feel like outsiders at first. They're going to look at everything through the LDS filter that they bring with them. And so they're not going to understand what people in this new church do and why they do it. They're going to see things that go against their LDS-rooted values and assumptions. And so they may assume that other people don't understand them or don't get their story. Or they may feel sensitive about feeling judged negatively by members of this new church. And a lot of these feelings and a lot of this disorientation is rooted in the idea that they're moving from one culture into another culture. So with that in mind, if you truly begin to understand understand Mormonism as a culture, then it's important finally that you don't neglect the journey issues. Now, when I talk about the journey issues, I'm talking about the emotional and relational and cultural transitions that people go through on their journey out of Mormonism and into faith in Christ and into His church. Now, it's true that former Mormons have a lot of theological questions and a lot of things they need to rethink about reality. And traditional Christians are very interested in making sure that that theology is correct. Now, while addressing doctrine is really important, I want to encourage you that by itself it's not enough. That mentoring a former Mormon is not just about getting the theology correct. Because Mormonism shapes the way that former Latter-day Saints think not only about God and about salvation, but about themselves and about life and relationships, about church, about so much more. And so much of the process of mentoring former Mormons deals with these journey issues of adapting to a new culture and dealing with loss and other emotions and forming a new sense of identity. And so, as important as it is to help former Mormons understand doctrinal issues, you won't be able to really help them find a new spiritual home in Christ and in His church unless you understand that Mormonism is a cultural identity.